I have more care to say than the will to go. William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. At first sight, it would appear that at some point between President Kennedy's "We Go to the Moon" speech in 1961 and July 1969, something went seriously wrong with the Apollo project. There is little doubt that the Apollo project started in all seriousness in 1961, and NASA did intend to take men to the moon and bring them back safely. So what went wrong? One answer will intrigue you. As we will discuss later, perhaps nothing went wrong. We will probably never fully know what the problem that caused NASA to embark on the most incredible act of deception, but clearly, at some point, a decision was made that the moon landings needed to be simulated, in other words, faked. The question is, can we infer from the available evidence when and why this decision was made? When? The precursor to the Apollo missions were the Mercury and Gemini programs. The first two manned Mercury launches were Alan Shepard, followed by Gus Grissom. At the time in 1961, the Americans had no rockets that could get men into low Earth orbit. Instead, they utilized the Redstone ballistic missile adapted to carry the Gemini capsule. This was a far from ideal method to lift the first American astronaut into space, but the urgency of the situation in regards to the competition to beat the Russians was politically crucial. The major problem facing NASA was that the Redstone had not proved to be entirely reliable. Out of 35 launches, 20 had been failures, so a better than average chance of a failure, 57%. This was a major concern for President Kennedy, as he did not want to add a dead astronaut to his presidency. He was so worried that he suggested postponing the launch of Alan Shepard aboard the Redstone rocket. Then out of the blue, we have this quoted on page 77 in Gerhard Winowski's book, One Small Step. But then quite suddenly, all was sweetness and light. On 22nd March 1961, at a White House meeting, Hugh L. Dryden, who was at that time the grand old man of American rocket technology, explained to the president that no unwarranted risks would be involved in the first manned Mercury flight. How interesting that even the launch of such a man into space with a Redstone rocket was supposed to be exactly that, an unwarranted risk. If no risk existed, could it mean that there would be no men on the Mercury-Redstone combination at all? There clearly was a very substantial risk, given the history of failures of the Redstone rocket, so why suddenly is the president told to relax when there is no unwarranted risk involved? Also, Edward C. Walsh, the manager of the National Aeronautics and Space Council, confidently asked President Kennedy, why postpone a success? This sudden confidence by Kennedy's advisors leads one to imagine that the fakery may have already been afoot as early as 1961. The Apollo project was an immense undertaking, further exacerbated by the very limited time frame set by President Kennedy. Within 2 years it was dodged with problems, development of the hardware, and was falling behind schedule, and the costs of the project were spiraling out of control. One of the most significant problems was the North American Aviation NAA, who were the contractors for the manufacturer of the Command and Service Module spacecraft and the second stage of the Saturn V launch vehicle. A review was conducted in November-December 1965 by a NASA team headed by Lieutenant General Samuel C. Phillips, director of the Apollo Moon landing program, to investigate the schedule slippage and the cost overruns incurred by NASA. This became known as the Phillips Report. The Phillips Report was a scathing denunciation of NASA's management of the Apollo program. The report stated, "Today, after 4.5 years and a little more than a year before the first flight, there are still significant technical problems and unknowns affecting the stage. Manufacturer is at least 5 months behind schedule. NAA's continued inability to meet internal objectives, as evidenced by the 5 changes in the manufacturing plan in the last 3 months, clearly indicates that extraordinary effort will be required if the contractor is to hold the current position, let alone better it." The report identified many problems in the performance of NAA, including deficiencies in logistics, systems engineering, cost estimating, workforce efficiency, and quality control. In summary, almost all the aspects of the contractor's work were inadequate. This was leading to a major delay in the Apollo project and significant cost overruns. In a letter from George E. Mueller, Associate Administrator for NAA Manned Spaceflight, to the President of NAA, he stated, I can see no way of improving future performance and meeting commitments which NAA must meet if we are to achieve the national objectives of Apollo, except to improve the management and technical competence of your Space and Information Systems Division. The Apollo project was falling seriously behind schedule and hammer-hagging funds on an unprecedented scale. Apollo 1. The first evidence that we have that something may have been amiss with the Apollo project comes from astronaut Gus Grissom, who had already been selected as the first man to step onto the moon. He had been in space before on 20 July 1961, where he rode the Liberty Bell 7 space capsule as part of the Mercury program and was the third American to fly in space. His flight was suborbital and lasted just 5 minutes and 37 seconds. Grissom is said to have traveled 302 miles, reaching a maximum height of just over 118 miles. Given that the accepted definition of space is that it starts at 100 miles from the Earth's surface, then Grissom only spent about 1 minute in actual space. Gus Grissom was publicly critical of the poor safety specifications of the Apollo project and even of its entire technical feasibility. He was so concerned about the Apollo project that on 22 January 1967, he held an unauthorized press conference in which he told reporters that the United States is at least a decade away from even contemplating a mission to land on the moon. Not surprisingly, he was severely reprimanded for giving the interview without the permission of NASA, particularly giving his total negative comment about the Apollo project. The Associated Press reported, "Pretty slim" was the way that he put the Apollo's chances of meeting its mission requirements. Following his reprimand, a few days later, Gus Grissom came out of a water tank for reduced gravity simulation of the supposed lunar module and hung a lemon attached to a coat hanger in front of the NASA emblem to indicate to any camera present, without speaking, that he and his fellow crew members, Roger Chaffee and Edward White, thought about the poor safety specifications and even with the entire technical feasibility of the Apollo project. Now, whether Grissom and his fellow astronauts were voicing something unique to themselves or something that was already been discussed privately within the NASA hierarchy, we cannot be sure. Whatever the situation, Grissom was a clear danger for NASA and its credibility. Chaffee and the Apollo 1 crew were killed during testing when a flash fire engulfed the oxygen-filled command module. They were the first United States astronauts to die in the line of duty. There had been intense speculation that the fire was no accident. The day after Grissom's death, it was reported that the FBI raided his home and seized all of his manuscripts and documents. These may have contained incriminating evidence of the disarray of the Apollo program and highlights its incompetence and disarray as stated by others before Congress. Scott Grissom, Gus Grissom's son, thinks that it was not an accident but a deliberate act to silence his father. He publicly stated in 1999 that he believes his father had been murdered. After examining the remains of his father's death capsule and the faulty switch blamed for causing the fire, he discovered a small and functionless piece of metal which appeared to have been deliberately inserted into the wiring. This almost certainly caused the spark and the resulting fire in the sealed atmosphere in the capsule of pure oxygen. Certainly, the family of Gus Grissom believed that he was intentionally eliminated by the DIA/CIA, as this video from Frank Matt explains. Poor safety procedures. Thomas Barron was a safety inspector during the construction of Apollo 1. After the fire in the Apollo 1 capsule, he testified before Congress 21 April 1967 that the Apollo program was in much disarray, that NASA would never have made it to the moon. Note that this was just 15 months before the launch of Apollo 8, which allegedly took the first astronauts into orbit around the moon. Barron had submitted a detailed 500-page report to Congress detailing his findings. He believed that his opinion made him a target and that he reported that he and his family had been harassed. 1 week after he had testified, his car mysteriously stalled on a level railway crossing and was struck by a train. He, his wife, and stepdaughter died in the accident. The accident was officially judged to be suicide. Some skeptics, the former being Bill Casing, believe that Barron was murdered to silence him. It is interesting to note that Barron's report on the failings of the NASA Apollo project had disappeared and has never been found to this date. The Clavius website has another more critical assessment of Thomas Barron and indicates that he was somewhat overzealous in his work. Note that we should not be so surprised that the Clavius website portrays Thomas Barron in such a bad light, given that the webmaster Jay Windley is one of the main NASA fanboys. However, it does make the point that if NASA were to silence him, that they would wait until after he had presented his evidence to Congress. It would have been more logical to have him silenced before, but then again the damning details of his investigation may not have been fully known beforehand. Although his original report has been lost or purposely disposed of, you can get some sort of idea of his claims in this excerpt posted on the Clavius website. You can also read Barron's testimony to Congress on the Clavius website, Appendix 407 and Appendix 408. The outcome of this tragedy was that the Apollo project was suspended pending a further investigation, which resulted in a further delay of 1 year following a complete redesign of the command module. In March 1967, the NASA director James Webb testified in front of the House Committee on Science and Astronautics, expressing doubts about the chances of fulfilling Kennedy's goal. He was the very man who for 6 years had confidently told President Kennedy that a man on the moon could be achieved within a decade. 1 year later, on October 7, 1968, James Webb suddenly left NASA just 3 months before the Apollo 8 flight to the moon, Robert Siemens, in January of the same year. This followed the sudden resignation of the NASA Assistant Director, Robert Siemens, in January of that same year. We also had the Mercury astronaut Wally Schirra announcing his departure from NASA just 4 days after James Webb had announced his departure. One has to wonder why, when the Apollo moon landing was less than a year away, did these people decide to leave NASA in such a hurry? It is at this juncture in 1967, or perhaps 1966, that some skeptics contend that the decision was made to fake the moon landings. Apollo Moon Hoax. In December 1966, Wernher von Braun, the chief architect of the Apollo program, participated in the NASA geological field trip to Antarctica together with the other top NASA executives. The trip's supposed purpose was to look at Antarctica as a learning experience for lunar bases and Mars colonization, and also to collect moon rocks for comparison with rocks to be brought back from the moon. On this trip, they collected several hundred pounds of meteorites originally from the moon, properly called lunites. It is probable that the lunites collected in Antarctica were sufficiently altered to be later passed off as moon rocks supposedly brought back by the Apollo missions. So the evidence points to the fact that before 1967 there appeared to be serious problems with the Apollo project, which necessitated collecting lunites to be used later as fake moon rocks. It had been safely assumed that the idea to fake the moon landings had certainly been taken by 1966. It is therefore extremely probable that Gus Grissom and his fellow astronauts on Apollo 1 knew of the planned fakery and did all they could to avoid being a party to it. This also may explain why James Webb, administrator of NASA, his deputy and astronaut Wally Schirra also decided to leave at the same time in 1967. It has always been assumed by the NASA skeptics that the mastermind behind the fakery of the Apollo videos was the film director Stanley Kubrick. During the period 1964 to the film's release in 1968, Kubrick was working on the acclaimed sci-fi movie 2001: A Space Odyssey. In making that movie, Kubrick collaborated closely with NASA, and NASA officials were frequent visitors to Kubrick on Shepperton Studios in the UK. I believe that it was most likely that the mastermind of the Apollo moon landings was an affiliate of Douglas Trumbull. However, I shall not be mentioning his name in this video. Kubrick himself was not a visual effects expert, but relied on the expertise of men like Trumbull, and possibly John Dykstra, a young special effects talent. Later, Douglas Trumbull and John Dykstra worked on the movie Silent Running. This collaboration of NASA with Kubrick could well place the NASA decision to fake the Apollo moon landings even earlier than 1966 than I mentioned above, perhaps even as early as 1964. This would be just 3 years after the Apollo project started. The question is, why did NASA need to fake the Apollo missions? There are several possibilities. The first, and perhaps the most obvious, is that they realized that there was a significant risk that NASA could not achieve the moon landing due to a failure of the technological developments. However, I firmly believe that the decision to fake the moon landing was taken irrespectively of any individual risk identified by NASA. It is no secret that the DIA, or some of the clandestine elements of the US government, maybe also the Central Intelligence Agency, had infiltrated NASA from its very inception. After all, NASA was a military establishment and still is to this day. Many of the people working at NASA would have been infiltrated DIA-CIA operatives. The Apollo project could not be allowed to fail. There were too many factors of national security and prestige to allow the hint of a failure. President Kennedy had made his declaration that the USA had the technological means to land men on the moon by the end of the decade. Come what it may, that must be shown to have been achieved. Anything less would be unthinkable. The risk to national defense and prestige for America was immense. The fact is that the US had virtually nothing in 1961 when it came to space exploration. Remember that at this time only one American, Alan Shepard, had even been briefly into space, and that it was only for a 15-minute and 23-second suborbital flight on top of a Redstone ballistic missile hastily adapted to accommodate the astronaut capsule. It should be emphasized that by the time of Kennedy's announcement, NASA had not even developed a rocket powerful enough to get astronauts into low Earth orbit, let alone a rocket to get them to the moon and back. I believe that early on, perhaps shortly after Kennedy's announcement, the clandestine unit within NASA decided that the mission would be faked. In this way, the USA could definitely demonstrate to the world, and particularly to the Soviet Union, that the USA had the capability to challenge them technologically. As Gene Kranz remarked, albeit in a different context, failure is not an option. The danger of relying on this achievement of science and technology was far too risky. That is not to say that NASA would not have been capable to achieve success, but faking it would make it a certainty, only if they could achieve a convincing fake. The success of the fakery was important for several compelling reasons. 1. They needed to fulfill Kennedy's stated goals at all costs. 2. The moon landings would demonstrate that the USA was the world leader in technology and space exploration. 3. The success of the moon landings would take the pressure off the US government in relation to the ongoing and increasingly unpopular Vietnam War. Some of the enormous fiscal allowances approved with public support for the moon landing could be diverted for military and other black op use which otherwise may have not been approved. So the importance of demonstrating success was paramount, and any methods would be considered to achieve it, faked or not. In the following chapters, we will also examine in detail the refutable evidence that the Apollo missions were totally faked. Too much radiation. These violent delights have violent ends, and in their triumph die, like fire and powder. William Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet. Radiation is just about everywhere. We receive it continually from the sun and from the rocks beneath our feet. It emanates from our television sets, radios, and mobile phones. We even absorb it from certain fruits, vegetables, and nuts. So much for being a clean living but radioactive vegetarian. Radiation and its effects on humans is a very complex subject beyond the understanding of the majority of us, not to mention the confusion among the scientists themselves. Of course, if the radiation is severe enough, we know the result. You will die. The question we need to answer is how much radiation is considered safe for the human body. Many of us will have been subjected to radiation in the forms of X-rays and CT scans, either at the dentist or in the hospital. Any X-ray or CT scan will damage tissue in your body. That is a fact. What is important is the amount you will receive during the duration for which you will receive it. Small doses of radiation can be tolerated by the body, even though they do cause damage to tissue, as the body has the ability to repair damaged tissue over time. We are all exposed to radiation every second of our lives from natural background radiation. As a guide, here are some estimates of the level of radiation that we receive from common X-ray, CT scan procedures as compared to normal background radiation. Chest X-rays are an equivalent to 2.4 days of natural background radiation. Skull X-rays are equivalent to 12 days of natural background radiation. Lumbar spine X-rays are equivalent to 182 days of natural background radiation. CT X-rays are equivalent to 243 days of natural background radiation. And CT abdomen X-rays are equivalent to 2.7 years of natural background radiation. So X-rays and CT scans are dangerous, but are judged by the medical world to be worth the risk, in that they may provide early detection of more harmful maladies. You may at this point be thinking that you are inadvertently reading some medical journal. Well, not quite. We need to try to understand radiation, as the Apollo astronauts needed to pass through what are thought to be extremely dangerous areas of radiation on their journey to the moon. So understanding this is important for what follows. we measure radiation with an instrument called a Geiger counter, named after its inventor, the German physicist Hans Geiger, in 1920. Radiation is measured in units called Röntgens, named after another German, Wilhelm Röntgen, who discovered X-rays in 1895, for which he received the first ever Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. There are several other units in which radiation is measured, at which point it becomes quite complex, so we will stick to just a few of them. For the purists, 1 Röntgen is the amount of ionizing radiation producing 1 electrostatic unit of positive or negative ionic charge in 1 cubic centimeter of air under standard conditions. What did he just say? Now, don't worry too much if you don't understand that definition. You are not alone. The Van Allen belts. Here on Earth, we are surrounded by 2 and sometimes 3 regions of intense ionizing radiation called the Van Allen radiation belts, which are formed as a result of the Earth's molten inner core, which mostly consists of iron. The spinning of the Earth results in molten iron creating a giant magnet with lines of magnetic flux radiating far out into space. It is these belts of magnetic flux that trap most of the harmful radiation from the Sun and keep the Earth safe and protected. This is the Earth's magnetosphere, and this is what enables us mere mortals to live here on Earth without dying due to an overdose of deadly radiation, unless of course you are partial to many vegetables. These belts were first detected by an American physicist, Dr. James Van Allen, in 1958, hence the name. He used balloons and rockets carrying instruments to measure the levels of radiation as they passed through this region. What he detected was that the radiation measured by Geiger counters first increased and then dropped and suddenly increased again. From this, he concluded that there were 2 distinct belts of radiation. It has now been established that there can sometimes be 3, depending on the level of solar flares occurring on the Sun. These radiation belts are like massive donuts circling the Earth. There is no agreement on the thickness of the Van Allen radiation belts. Van Allen himself estimated that they extend 64,000 miles from Earth, whereas NASA claims that they only extend to 24,000 miles. This may be academic, as even beyond the radiation belts there is total exposure to solar radiation particles with no protection from the Earth's magnetosphere. As noted above, the Earth has a magnetic field with a north and south pole, as we know from using an ordinary compass when a youthful Boy Scout or Girl Guide. It is estimated that the magnetic field reaches out 36,000 miles into space into a region we call the magnetosphere. It is the magnetosphere that prevents most of the harmful particles from the Sun carried in the solar wind from reaching the Earth. Particles from the solar wind enter the magnetosphere and are directed along the lines of magnetic flux towards the poles, causing the impressive displays of the northern lights, Aurora Borealis, and the southern lights, Aurora Australis. It is relevant in our discussion to note that the radiation belts are weakest near the Earth's poles and most intense around the equator. The question then, is it possible for humans to traverse these regions of radiation and remain unharmed with the correct number of finger and toes? It is on this basis that the moon landing skeptics make their case. They claim that the Van Allen radiation belts are the impenetrable barrier deadly to any spacefarer who attempts to traverse them. Therefore, they conclude that the Apollo missions to the moon could never have taken place. In consequence, they say that man never walked on the face of the moon. We know that the astronauts on the Apollo missions that supposedly went to the moon never died from, or as far as we know, no astronaut has ever suffered from any form of radiation illness. So, if it is impossible for humans to survive the Van Allen radiation belt, then Apollo was, at least in part, hoaxed regardless of what all other evidence suggests. The level of radiation in the Van Allen belts is determined by mostly unpredictable solar particle emissions such as solar flares. There is evidence to suggest that the major flares occur at their most savage according to an 11-year cycle. The general unpredictability of those solar flares implies that any space mission through the Van Allen radiation belts does carry an inestimable danger to the astronauts. Clearly, this would imply that NASA would have carefully studied the Van Allen radiation belts, and we must assume that they concluded that it was not dangerous to send astronauts traveling through them. Paradoxically, 1969 was the height of that 11-year solar flare cycle, so the danger would have been in its greatest for Apollo 11, and it would not have been possible to pick a worse time to sojourn to the moon. Van Allen radiation belts source NASA. It is interesting to note what James Van Allen himself said about the dangers of the radiation belts in a scientific paper published in Scientific America in March 1959, long before the Apollo era, in which he states, Our measurements show that the maximum radiation level of 1958 is equivalent to between 10 and 100 Roentgens per hour, depending on the still undetermined portion of protons to electrons. Since a human being exposed for 2 days or even 10 Roentgens would have only an even chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight. Unless some particular way can be found to shield space travelers against the effects of radiation, manned space rockets can best take off through the radiation-free zones over the poles. Note Van Allen's final sentence, manned space rockets can best take off through the radiation-free zone over the poles. So Van Allen is clearly suggesting a route in which would minimize the astronauts' exposure to this deadly radiation. Remember, he said that the radiation is equivalent to between 10 and 100 Roentgens per hour, and that even a dose of 10 Roentgens over 2 days would give a 50-50 chance of survival? The Apollo astronauts, according to NASA, would spend only about 2 hours going through the Van Allen belts on the outward journey and about 2 hours on the return journey. So based on James Van Allen's findings, without protection from the radiation, the astronauts would have received a significant dose of radiation of between 40 and 400 Roentgens. A more modern unit of radiation exposure risk is the sievert, and 1 Roentgen is basically equivalent to 0.009 sieverts. So the astronauts would be exposed to between 0.37 and 3.7 sieverts after passing through the Van Allen radiation belts. It is not easy to state categorically what this would do to the astronauts, but the following is a rough guide. A dose of 0.35 was the average exposure of Chernobyl residents who were relocated after the blast in 1986. Some died later from radiation-related illnesses. A 1 sievert accumulated dose is estimated to cause a fatal cancer many years later in 5% of people. A 5 sievert single dose, which would kill half of those exposed to it within a month. Unfortunately, the range of radiation given by Van Allen is so wide, 400 to 400 Roentgens, that it is difficult to decide conclusively what the effects might be on the astronauts. Perhaps all we can conclude is that at the lowest level, the astronauts would survive into old age, but at the highest level, would probably not. We do not know that the Apollo spacecraft did not have any significant radiation protection except its construction from a thin skin of aluminum, steel, and some plastic cladding. Similarly, the lunar module for those missions that landed on the moon, the protection from radiation was minimal. The pro-NASA group would maintain that this was adequate protection from the radiation, but this seems totally inadequate. On one occasion in 1990, the space shuttle went to an altitude of 385 miles when it launched the Hubble telescope. The astronauts reported seeing shooting stars as cosmic rays hit the optic nerve, and this was far below the Van Allen belts. So the skeptics have always contended that the Apollo missions were impossible, and consequently man never set foot on the moon. However, NASA has published their official data on the average radiation received by the Apollo astronauts, which are surprisingly orders of magnitude less than we calculated above. From the official NASA figures, then the Apollo astronauts only received an extremely low degree of radiation accumulation. The minimum figure based on the Van Allen paper would have been 40 Roentgens, which is about 35 rad, which is another order of magnitude more than the NASA figures. Do you notice anything rather strange in these figures? Let me explain what the problem is. Note, for example, that the average number of rads per crew members is the same for Apollo 11 and Apollo 8, which are completely different types of missions. Apollo 7 remained in low Earth orbit for 11 days, whereas Apollo 8 spent 6 days going to the moon and back. This means that the Apollo 8 traversed the Van Allen radiation belts and was outside the Earth's protective magnetosphere for more than 5 days. In comparison, the radiation dose in low Earth orbit is about 0.16 rads per crew member per day, and the figure for Apollo 8 is about 0.03 rads. From this, one may conclude that the radiation passing through the Van Allen belts and beyond is only double that of low Earth orbit. If these NASA figures are true, then the research that James Van Allen conducted was completely wrong by orders of magnitude. From this analysis, it is not possible to definitely conclude whether the astronauts would have been severely affected by radiation or not. According to NASA, then the radiation was minor, but according to the Van Allen paper, it would have been much higher.